Hi everybody and welcome to another Firebrand video. In this video we're going to look at a recent video by Russell Brand on Alexei Navalny. Okay, I was wondering how he might address this.
The death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has caused an outcry in the West, as well as calls for further funding for Ukraine in their war against Russia. What, though, is the position of the West when it comes to outspoken critics of establishment policies, whether it's Gonzalo Lira or Julian Assange? Where's that conversation? Let's have it now.
Right, so yeah, like I said, I was interested to see how he might cover this, because it's going to be a pretty hard sell to cover the Navalny story whilst standing up for his biases, the bias towards Russia and the association with Trump. And so it's going to be a really difficult situation for them, because it's pretty hard to paint it as anything other than what it is, which is a disgusting execution of your opposition by a dictator, an authoritarian dictator. And this is coming at a time where people like Russell Brand, Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson, and the like are all doing their best to launder the reputation of Russia, present them as being admirable. Their anti-woke stances make them, defenders of freedom, and setting up this sort of false dichotomy between the left wing and the right wing, and painting the left wing as being the authoritarians when really they are the opposite of that, and presenting the right wing as somehow being freedom loving when indeed they're the opposite of that. It's going to be really difficult for them to sell it as anything other than what it is. So I was really interested to see how they cover this story. And I was also interested to see that Russell Brand made probably an intelligent decision to kind of mix that story together with something different, meaning that he can kind of cover aspects of it, but then veer away when he wants to. And so he's merging the story with the Julian Assange story. So let's see where he goes with it.
Hello there, you awakening wonders. Thanks for joining us on our voyage to truth and freedom that we undertake together. Remember, if you
blah blah, indoctrination.
can support our content, we make additional videos every week just for our community, as well as interviewing important journalists who will be critical of the establishment. And at a time like this, where there is ongoing complexity and the need for adult conversations about difficult issues, this is precisely the coverage and conversation that's required.
I'm not so sure that it is. I mean, he obviously paints himself as being independent, but he is clearly biased, and he is a multimillionaire in his own right, as I pointed out in previous videos, and he's paid for by Rumble, which is Trump media organization, also founded together with Vivek Ramaswamy's money. So yeah, maybe not quite the independent.
It's odd that Alexei Navalny has died at this time.
It's odd. What do you mean it's odd? Alexei Navalny decided to go back to Russia and was executed. I mean, okay, it's an unusual way of phrasing it. It's odd. Odd in what way?
Just after Putin has been interviewed by Tucker. It's extraordinary and it's sad. Let's have a look at Alexei Navalny, what his politics were. Let's have a look at how the death is being utilised by the establishment media. And let's have a look too to see if there's any hypocrisy in this coverage, given that Julian Assange is still in prison in Belmarsh without trial, essentially for being critical of the policies of the West.
Okay, right. So I'm seeing like some diversion here, but let's carry on.
Particular with regard to military action abroad. Let's see if we can hold all of this in our heads simultaneously and assess whether or not this death, which still as yet may not be a murder. I mean, it's quite likely it is a murder.
Obviously it isn't clear, but it is kind of clear. I mean, it's very consistent. There is a large body of evidence supporting it. So, I mean, he's kind of equivocating here he was suggesting that he does agree with it, and I think that's kind of a position that he's going to hold. It's pretty hard to deny that it's not, but you might be able to get away with casting some, well, we're not quite certain about it, and that's all that I think is going to be able to get away with.
Died in prison. Putin is the sort of person that would have people murdered. There's no question about that. But is it being utilised to legitimise further expenditure and funding of the Ukraine war? And is it hypocritical to declare that this is morally outrageous?
Well, I don't think we're looking for moral equivalence. Really what we're doing is we're trying to assess the threat of Russia, and Russia will very clearly demonstrate that it isn't a political democracy. The guy assassinated the leader of his opposition. This is a ruthless authoritarian dictatorship. Okay? There's no other way of phrasing it. And it wasn't just that he assassinated somebody. He's assassinated plenty of other people. Alexander Litvinenko in the UK a few years back. But the fact that he assassinated his political opposition.
While Julian Assange is still in prison and Gonzalo Lira died in the Ukrainian.
Now, I'm not going to say that I agree with the imprisoning of Julian Assange, but you have to understand that there is a difference between the two political between the two things. Not only was Julian Assange not assassinated, he also isn't the leader of the political opposition. So it is a kind of false equivalence. If we were looking at the equivalent, then it would be Joe Biden assassinating Donald Trump. Okay? And that would be what we would be talking about.
Jail.
Now, where outrage is growing following the death of Alexei Navalny, the staunch Putin critic who Russian authorities say died suddenly Friday in a Siberian prison.
The death of Alexei Navalny yesterday was a reminder of the extraordinary brutality of Putin and his government.
Whatever story they tell, let us be clear, Russia is responsible.
Well, they've really leapt to that conclusion. And again,
okay, so again, he says, let's just accept it, but then cast aspersion over it. And then let's say that it is. And then he cast aspersions on it. So they've really leapt to that conclusion, have they? I don't think it's a leap to jump to that conclusion.
and it's probably true. But for all of that
So
piety and condemnation, do you see an...
So he offers the idea that it isn't true and then says it probably is true, but then, maybe it isn't. So, is really trying to muddy the water on that as much as possible, whilst trying to say, well, look, I was saying that it was probably true, but then he keeps on casting doubt over it. He keeps on deliberately coming back to that point.
They've really leapt to that conclusion, and again, it's probably true. But for all of that piety and condemnation, do you see an absence of appropriate piety when it comes to the case of Julian Assange, who's...
Okay, so you see, he only addresses the Navalny point to then make a point about Assange. He doesn't actually make any statement on Assange, on Navalny. The only statement he's made so far is that he was killed and we don't know who by. Those are the only things that he's really said. And probably Vladimir Putin. But really, again, we don't know who by. So those are the only things that he said. As soon as he raises a point, he dismisses it. So far, he's dismissed it and then moved straight onto Assange, where he's much more comfortable pontificating.
Still in Belmarsh prison right now, whose hearing is this week, which will not be covered by the Western media. To remind you, what Julian Assange did was reported on war crimes of the West, primarily in the Middle East. For this, he's been imprisoned in various forms for about 10 years now. What's interesting here is not whether or not Alexei Navalny was murdered by Putin. Let's assume he was. Let's say that Putin is definitely...
Just the number of cuts taking place, the number of edits, the jumps in between to keep the dialogue quick.
Definitely a war criminal, definitely a tyrant, definitely murders people in jail. Let's analyse the position from which the West is criticising Russia and Putin. Is it one of moral clarity, purity, or is it from a position of hypocrisy?
Okay, so he's saying that the West is criticizing Russia and we shouldn't be doing it because it's hypocritical. I don't know about you, but I've never ordered the assassination of a political opponent. You know, I don't know about you, but I've never done those things. So is my criticism valid? Is my criticism valid? Can I criticize him? Can I observe that I don't think he should have invaded the Ukraine? Can I observe those things? Can I? Because a technique that Russell Brand uses quite often is saying, well, the West has done these things, and so there can be no criticism of Russia. And he's done this in many different ways across his other videos. And that's not true. That doesn't stack up. It sounds correct if you were to hear it quickly without opportunity for thought. But as soon as you listen to these things, you realize actually he's just as liable for criticism as anybody else. He should not be exempt.
We should be clear about what has happened here. Putin's Russia imprisoned him, trumped up charges against him.
Like, I guess what you could do is just imagine in your mind they were talking about Julian Assange, and then...
Yeah, you could do, but if you were doing that, then you'd be ignoring all of the content about Navalny, which I think is probably the point. So he's inviting you to listen to the news reports about Navalny and think only about Assange.
Is there at any point a contradiction there? Trumped up charges against him, accusations appeared out of thin air. Essentially the argument we're making...
Well, I mean, this is neither here nor there, because the only way that he seems to be able to address the Navalny situation is by every time he raises something, muddy the water, and then talk about something about Assange.
Is this: are our governments in a position to wage war, or a proxy war at least with Russia, on the basis of moral reasons when the conduct that they are condemning is so similar?
They're not waging a war on Ukraine because the fact that he has killed somebody, or whether he's done right or wrong. They are concerned about Russian expansionism. And the reason there should be no consideration of this in terms of how it affects our consideration of whether Russia represents a danger on the global stage. And Russia's actions with regards to Navalny and other assassinations are an example of how emboldened Russia is to be able to feel that it is able to do those things.
To their own conduct.
Sent him to a Arctic penal colony, and now he's tragically died. And we should hold Putin accountable for this, and no one should be in any doubt about the dreadful nature of Putin's regime in Russia.
That's what true morals and principles mean, that the values and principles can be applied to any situation.
Yeah, that's all well and good, but, you know, what you're doing here is distracting.
They're not used as a weapon. Aha! Right, this guy's dead. Brilliant. Remember, we hate Putin, don't we? And we can use this to amplify our narrative that we should perpetuate this profitable war. If they were...
Again, yeah, I mean, if you look at the framing, he consistently uses framing, so the profitable war, okay?
Real principles, they would be talking about Julian Assange and Gonzalo Lira in the same way. Oh yeah, should Julian Assange really be in Belmarsh? He hadn't had a trial or anything. Those would be the kind of conversations you'd hear David Cameron or Joe Biden publicly having. You won't, and there's a reason for that, isn't there?
You know, like millions of...
See, these are the exact type of conversations, the ones where you might agree with large parts of it. You might agree with it, but listen to the small adjustments and framing, and listen to the way that he's using the dialogue in order to be able to subtract from one narrative and add to another. Even the fact that this is the story, this is the story and how it's been edited, you know, the fact that he chose this story, the fact that he chose to address it in the way that he did, they all make statements about what his priorities are and which stories he chooses to amplify and how he chooses to address the challenging elements of different stories.
People around the world, I'm literally both not surprised and outraged by the news. reported death of Alexei Navalny.
We all know that this is about utility. We all know that Joe Biden didn't have a genuine emotional reaction. What? Alexei Navalny's dead? Oh no, he was my favourite opponent of Russia's tyranny. Remember, the United States have definitely participated in the murder of political opponents, whether that's Saddam Hussein or Colonel Gaddafi. These people were just like publicly, almost evangelically murdered as a result of becoming enemies of American foreign interests.
Right. And so if you or I were elected as the leader of our countries, then we wouldn't be allowed to say we think it's disgraceful that another country has assassinated somebody just because our country has got a history of doing things that aren't great. Every country has a history of doing things that aren't great. And yet, so then the notion that nobody would be allowed to criticize any of these actions, doesn't matter how disgraceful they are on a world stage, that's it. Nobody is allowed to discuss them.
In addition to the crimes exposed by Julian Assange, whose plight is not so openly discussed. So if this is about moral, we should be not surprised because we knew how bad Putin was, but we should be outraged because we knew how bad Putin is. If that's your position, what is your position on Assange?
He bravely stood up to the corruption, the violence.
Like Assange?
So he is consistently inviting us to only think about Assange every time that Navalny is mentioned. You notice that he hasn't once had any kind of critical thought on the Navalny situation. I think this is typical of what I can expect from Russell Brand. And it is really interesting to get to sort of teasing apart some of the more delicate issues, because it's not always clear. You know, I could take a series of accurate stories, all of which I agreed with, and due only to editing, I could shape the dialogue in a way that was contrary to the truth. So if I only pick negative news stories about a particular demographic, I can tell the truth all the time. But the fact that I'm just presenting those stories and how I'm presenting them does enough to mislead my audience. So I think it's interesting to look at those points with Russell Brand. Anyway, I'll leave it there and I'll see you again in the next video.